Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the next installment of the Professional Lighting Techniques. I am your host, Garrett Sammons, and this, of course, is the next installment put on by Light Panels. If you have missed any of the previous in this series that we have discussed, we've talked about a whole host of different applications that filmmakers can find themselves in, or scenes and scenarios that filmmakers can find themselves in, and how to approach those lighting techniques. If you have missed any of those, go take a look at Light Panel's webpage or on their YouTube channel. There is a playlist for all of those previous sessions. Don't go now, stay here for this one, but go back and take a look at some of those, because some of the themes and things that we talk about build on sessions that we have already discussed. So I'm sure the Light Panels team can put a link to that up there. So go ahead, feel free to catch up on all of those after this, because as we move forward and do more, we are going to continue to build on things that we have discussed and learned up to this point. Again, I'm Garrett. I am a commercial director and cinematographer by day, and thanks again to Light Panels for allowing me to do this with you. Today, as you could probably tell by the intro, we are going to be discussing how to light for green screen. And we're going to look at a couple of different applications and different use cases for how one could use green screen. There are a lot of things that filmmakers can do, from putting text replacement or screen replacement on different things. We can put people in environments that they aren't actually in. We could do some of cool double exposure and compositing techniques like what you saw there in the intro. A lot of different things that you're capable of doing. Today's example, the thing that we're going to be talking and looking at today and breaking down, we created an HBO style intro sequence, or an opening sequence, something that gives a tone, a vibe, an overall aesthetic of what one could expect when watching a show. Obviously, we didn't film a show. We created something for something that doesn't exist. And in our case, green screen is a great application, especially for that double compositing that we looked at a moment ago. But also when you need to exceed budget, or you need to exceed your set design and value, when otherwise you wouldn't be able to. So if you can't go out and film in crazy environments or film crazy effects and those kind of things, doing that digitally after the fact, or doing that in post, is a great way of getting that same look, getting that same feel, but on a much tighter timetable and with obviously much more limited resources as you need. So before we dive in, I want to go over a couple of things. Hey, Eric, good to see you again from Munich. Thanks for tuning in. A couple of things here real quick. One, there is a Q&A module here in the chat. So if at any point in time through any of this discussion you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or to throw them into the Q&A. I will do my best to answer those as we go through it. So, you know, if things come up, please feel free to use the Q&A or use the chat, and I will kind of go through that as we kind of get into this. So before we can talk about how we lit this particular scene, you obviously need to see the scene itself. But before we even get into that, there are a couple of basic concepts when lighting green screen that are just universal, no matter what the application of green screen is. So when you are lighting a green screen, or for green screen, the first thing you need to do is to make sure that you have an even lighting on the background, right? Whether you're using a pop-up green screen, whether you're using some form of like a muslin fabric green screen, or in our case, you're in a green screen psych studio, you need to make sure that the background is as evenly lit as possible. And for two kind of main reasons. One, obviously, we need to make sure that we keep our chroma keying, or what we do after the fact, as easy as possible. The more time we spend in pre-production and production, the easier a time we're going to have in post. If we don't nail the lighting or don't have an even key on our background, even lighting on our background, we're going to spend way more time after the fact trying to correct for that or trying to adjust for that than we really need to. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then the second part of that is that we need to make sure that we expose our camera to that green screen, right? So don't worry about other lights yet. The first thing we need to do, once we have an even lighting on our green screen, we then need to make sure that our camera is exposed to that lighting. Our foreground elements, we can always add lights, take lights away, adjust the lighting as we need to. But if we don't properly expose for that background, again, the green is either going to get too hot, and then it's going to be really hard because it's going to bleed into some of our skin tones, or it's going to be too dark, which is then going to bleed into our shadows. And it's, again, going to make pulling those keys in our composites much, much more difficult. So before we do anything, before we light any scene, make sure that we have an even lighting on our background environment and making sure that our camera is properly exposed to that lighting. That's one of the nice things about this 1x1 hard, which we're going to be talking more about here in a little bit. But because it is such an incredibly bright light with such a large spread of light, it makes lighting studio environments quite simple. So even if you're not in a pre-lit studio like we are, this is a great light that you can use to then, of course, light for that green screen. The other cool thing, because this is an RGB light, you don't just have to use your bicolor light like we have here. You can punch into certain color modes here and actually illuminate your chroma key green onto a background wall. So like if you're shooting against a white wall, or the studio that you're in doesn't have a green screen, you can actually blast a ton of green light onto a wall to create that same color that you otherwise might not have access to. So everything we're going to be talking about now keeps those things in mind. We're exposing for our green screen, and we are keeping that as evenly lit as we possibly can. So with that in mind, we're now going to take a look at the sequence that we're going to then be breaking down. So we're going to take a look at that. Again, if you have questions through any of this, throw them in the Q&A, throw them in the chat. I will answer them as we go. But before we go any further, let's take a look at this. Dancing in between the lines. There's no space for me. Okay, so we got a lot going on there. So again, this very HBO, true detective kind of stuff. But everything that you saw there that had talent on camera, of course, was all done in this green screen studio. None of that was shot practically, right? We weren't on set for any of that stuff. That was all done after the fact. And we're going to break down how we did that. And you can tell we've got a couple of different scenes, a couple of different applications that we use green screen for. So the first one that I want to talk about is how we lit the fire, right? So there's the sequence where we have the two people, they're holding hands, and then of course we have the one person who turns and kind of looks at the camera, and it is lit like this. So this is primarily lit with the 1x1 hard. We had two of these lights set up opposite our talent from the camera. We would call this a reverse key. We used the built-in fire effect that the 1x1 hard has available to us. And the nice thing about that is that then gives us the freedom to know that we can then put them into our background environment. In this case, of course, the burning bonfire, and have that light wrap around in the way that it normally would. So then that way, of course, when we put them in that sequence like that, it then looks like we actually have them standing in front of the fire. So not only is the 1x1 hard an extremely bright light, it's 5 times brighter than the 1x1 soft, which is already an incredibly bright fixture, the behavior of the light that comes out of this fixture, as the name implies, is a much more hard light. when you're standing in front of a fire, you are very close to a very bright source, so there's good wrap to that light, but it is a very direct, not diffused light. So we want to make sure that we have that light behavior working the right way. So anytime you are setting up a compositing shot or a chroma key shot like this in a green screen studio, you do need to know what the background you're going to be putting it on is, because that is going to determine your camera angles, that's going to determine your lensing, that's going to determine your lighting. If you don't know what your background environment is going to be, it's going to make setting up your camera and setting up your lights extremely difficult. So for this, obviously, we weren't going to set a huge bonfire. We didn't have the ability or the budget or the time to make all of that happen. So we then partnered with Film Supply, who then gave us a whole bunch of these really sweet pre-existing assets. So I could go through their library, pick the shots that I want. Then I take screenshots of those shots. I load those onto my iPad. I take that with me to set. So then that way, as we're setting up camera, as we're setting up lights, I can then compare what I have on my monitor to what I have on the iPad. And I can know that that compositing is going to work really, really nicely. So always make sure that you have your background and your foreground together, because lining those up after the fact becomes really, really, really difficult. We're not going to talk a lot about the process of our post-production, but we are going to talk about the lighting here. So if we take a look at this, this is our first setup here. We backed the lights up a little further than we were originally had on here, but you can see here we laid blankets out on the ground. These would be negative fill blankets. So these blankets are black. So as we laid them down, it prevents green spill from coming back up onto our talent. And then we took 2 of the 1x1 hards, we put them behind our talent, and we took each light and we pointed it at the opposing individual. And then that allowed us to get that really, really nice light wrap. But of course, we then didn't want that spilling onto the lens of our camera. So what we then did is we took 2 duvetine frames. Duvetine, as we've talked about in previous episodes, is a black fabric. We use that as a negative fill or a flag, and that then prevents light spill from coming onto the camera, and it also pulls light away from our talent. So as you can see here, by placing those in position between our subject and our camera, we're then able to not only prevent spill from the light entering the lens of the frame, ruining our contrast, we can then also suck some of the light off of the camera side of our talent and helping kind of create that silhouette feature there. So if we take a look at this real quick here, this will show just kind of a quick process shot of how we got this here. So the first, of course, is this is how it was shot. We then colored that to Rec 709. We chroma keyed it out, we put the background on, and then we actually did a color pass on it to then kind of create this final look. If we didn't light our green screen evenly, and if we didn't expose our camera to that green screen, getting a really hard composite like that in a silhouette form with light wrap is going to make it really, really, really difficult. So this is why lighting is so incredibly important, because that is going to dictate how easy or how effective you're able to actually chroma key something out. Okay, so that's our first setup here. So we have this fire set up, and that was for all of the shots. That was for them standing in front of the flames. That's for the guy who's kind of turning toward the end of the sequence. All of that is composited that way with that lighting setup. Now, if you weren't in a green screen studio environment, you would then also need to consider how you are going to light the background environment or the background cyc, as well as our foreground here. Because we were in a cyc studio, we obviously have pre-lighting for everything, which makes it a lot easier for us. But if you're going to be using a pop-up green screen, or if you're going to be using muslin, we need to make sure that those lighting of that is also simple. So if I was going to be filming this not in the green screen studio, I would simply take the 2 1x1 hards that I have here, I duplicate those out, and I would have 2 1x1 hards on the 45s pointed at our green screen environment. If you're using muslin, which is kind of a very common cloth that you would use for kind of chroma keying or general backgrounds or photography backgrounds and that kind of thing, you would then really need to be worried about wrinkles. Muslin is something that wrinkles quite quickly. So putting two lights on 45-degree opposing angles towards that is then, of course, going to help offset some of those wrinkles. Garrett, to answer your question, yes, this webinar will be available for reviewing. Again, that again will be on that link that's in the chat here on the Light Panels website and on Light Panels YouTube channel. So if you want to revisit any of this stuff, go back through it. It'll be available after this there. I think it'll go up probably tomorrow or the next day. But yes, you'll be able to re-review that there. Okay, so that's our first setup. Our first setup is that fire shot. The next setup that I want to show you is kind of the opposing to that in terms of our environment. And that was, of course, our underwater sequence. So here you can kind of see as we're moving through this, we then filmed one of our characters underwater. Underwater is quite a tricky thing to film, of course, because the behavior of our subject and our talent is quite different. But again, we took a 1x1 hard, we put that overhead on a simple combo stand, booming combo stand. We put a DOP choice snap bag over it with a grid. We took a 4x8 bounce card through that underneath. We took two flags on either side, and that then allowed us to get that look as though they were underwater. You can see that we threw a fan up on them, so then that way their hair kind of moved the way that it would, and we filmed the whole thing in slow motion. That way we could kind of get a look that was very top down, as if somebody were underwater, filming it in slow motion, which makes some of that movement a little bit more forgivable. Daniel, it says, at what level do you expose the background? 18% gray, or what contrast ratio in relation to the talent key? So again, real quick here, depending on the camera will depend exactly on how you would expose for that. If you're going to be using false color that's linked into your camera, you would be kind of working at that neutral 50, that IRE 50 to 60 is kind of where you'd be living there. A gray 18 is absolutely fine for that as well. If you're filming with red and you're going to be exposing with stoplights, you're going to be making sure that you're absolutely neutral. You're not above or below. But yeah, the idea is you want that to be exposed absolutely neutral within the camera, not up or down. And then it's all about lighting your foreground. Like when we're filming with cinema cameras, we don't really mess with the internals of cameras that much, right? So like in the mirrorless world, you get cameras that can shoot at, 15,000 ISO or 25,000 ISO, or, even up and beyond that, especially with Sony cameras. Traditionally, you're going to get the best dynamic range out of your camera, the best noise and light performance out of your camera, and just the general balance of what that camera is able to produce if you kind of keep and adhere to some basic principles within your camera. Whether your camera is a $100 camera or a $100,000 camera, you're going to be kind of working with your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. Your frame rate should be set to whatever your broadcast standards are. In America, Cinema is 23976, commonly referred to as 24. I know in the PAL system or the PL system, you're going to be using 25 frames per second. Some legacy television, here's 30. So your frame rate is going to be dictated solely based on what your output is going to be. But your shutter speed should be double that of your frame rate. If you're working with cinema cameras, you're going to be working with shutter angle. That should be 180 degrees in general, unless there's an artistic reason to shift from that. Your ISO should be set to native, whatever that native is within your camera. Your white balance should obviously be set at neutral. And then your aperture is the one thing that you can kind of vary depending on what look you're going for. For green screen, blur is the enemy. We want absolutely no blur. So we're going to actually close the aperture down somewhere between around, like if you're working with photo, be like a T8 or to T10, or F8 to F10. If you're working with cinema, it's going to be like an F6.4 to F8, kind of in that. But we want to have a long enough depth of field that we're not going to get blur on our subject, because that's going to make our compositing a lot easier. But if we adhere to kind of pretty strict rules within our camera, we then need to make sure that, of course, we have enough light to mess around with. anytime you modify a light, you're either losing intensity or you're losing spread, but you're always losing something, which is why making sure that you buy the brightest, most accurate light your budget can afford is always the way to go, which is what makes this fixture so incredible. I can modify this however I want and still have plenty of light to work with, that I don't have to then worry about losing light in a way that's going to degrade my footage. So if you do expose for your background and you are at that neutral 50, having a really bright fixture is going to make it so you can then set your exposure values or your exposure readouts of your foreground elements to then match that of your background. And that's what makes something like this work really, really well. But when we talk about light behavior, going back to this water sequence here, we, of course, have singular directional light, which is going to be top down. If we're underwater, obviously, the light is going to be coming from above us as the sun or moon or whatnot comes through the water. We also know that you're in a very large void, so there's not going to be light really spilling or bouncing from anywhere else, which is why we bring flags in on the side to kind of eliminate that. But we don't obviously want it to just be a spotlight, which is then why we throw the bounce up underneath. And you can see that here in this setup here. So directly above our talent is where we have that 1x1 hard. We have that in the softbox or the DOP choice snap bag. We then, of course, put an egg crate or a grid on that to keep it very, very directional. It doesn't change the light behavior. It just changes the light spread. And then we brought in those two negative fills, that duvetine on either side. Behind our subject, you can see here that we put a quasar double rainbow. That is a LED tube fixture. And the reason why we used the rainbow here from Quasar Science is because we wanted the edge light behind our subject to have a really wide spread. So we didn't want it to be too terribly focused. We wanted to have that beam angle be really, really large, as it naturally would be. We didn't have it all that bright to where it's coming across as being quite obvious. We just wanted it to be enough that it's going to separate our foreground from our background. This is something we've talked about in previous series or episodes within this series, but especially when we're compositing and especially when we're doing green screen work, separating your foreground and your background elements are so unbelievably important because, of course, we're killing our background, right? We're removing that background. So then again, real quick here from a process standpoint, we come here, this is what we shot. Then, of course, we then did a Rec 709 pass on it, chroma keyed that out through a background on it, did a color pass, and then, of course, the final shot then looks something like that. But again, the only reason why that works, even remotely, as being underwater is because, of course, we have that slow motion that we're filming in, because as you guys know, when you're underwater, there's a lot more physical resistance, so things float and move a little bit more differently in water than they do in air. Okay, so that's our second setup. We have fire, which was the first one. We have background, which is, or water, which is the second one. And then we did two kind of different lighting setups for our portraiture work or our double exposure work here. And this is kind of a different application for green screen. When you're going to be doing double exposure in video, you do need to create a matte or an alpha matte, which is going to be creating where your background element is going to bleed through and where it's not going to bleed through. And if you are just going to be filming this traditionally, you either are going to have to go through and roto out your subject, or you're going to have to create a contrast matte in order to then create your alpha matte. And it adds a lot of complexity to the post process. The nice thing about compositing something with green screen is that we bypass a ton of that initial work that would be required in post by then having a built-in alpha matte with our compositing. Dorian says, would it be available to watch again somewhere? Yep, real quick here. We talked about this a little earlier. This is going to be going up on Light Panel's YouTube channel. Light Panels, if we could throw that link again to the web page in the chat for those who may have joined late. If you guys missed the beginning of this, you can go on to Light Panel's website. All of this is going to be reposted up there, and you'll also be able to find that on their YouTube channel, which you should just subscribe to anyway, because they post all sorts of really cool stuff, including this series there. Okay, so when we're talking about doing this double exposure piece, here is one of the two setups that we did here. You can see that we are filming one subject at a table. We are then using a cutter or a floppy. In this case, we did kind of a pseudo makeshift floppy. This is, again, to be acting as that negative spill coming up and over. Our key light is that same 1x1 hard with our grid and snap bag on it. Our background light is going to be the Astra 6X, which you just saw me messing with there. And we're actually going to be using that as a pretty hard background light there. And this is that double exposure effect. We can see our subject. We can kind of see these buildings kind of coming through behind them. We have this really nice contrasting look on our subject there. And to do this double exposure compositing like that, contrast is the most important thing, because the way that the alpha or lumimats work with that is if you have stuff that falls really deep into your shadows for contrast and really bright into your highlights for contrast. And again, that goes back to where this fixture is really great, because this is such a bright light that I can get it really close and really bright to get really, really, really nice highlights. And then using that floppy on the other side, we're then able to pull the light off from the other side to create that sense of contrast. And again, here, let's take a look at this. This will show you exactly what I'm talking about. So here we have the 1x1 hard in the DOP choice snap bag with the grid over it. We have a bounce in front of our talent. We did pull that halfway through because we liked having more contrast than less. Then on the side over there, you can see we have the floppy cutter on that side, which then kind of was on the side and came up over the 45 to pull off all of the light that the Gemini hard was pushing onto our talent. And then we are using the Astra in the background as our edge light, which is what really helps separate that, especially with the hair. If you guys have ever had to chroma key or composite hair, you know that that can get tricky, especially if you don't have that lighting done right. But if you look at this real quick here, you can see we have a really, really nice clean key around the hair, even with the loose bits that are on the back of the head. And that is simply because we have that lit really, really well, separating that foreground from that background. Again, we're not really diving into compositing in this as much as we're talking about lighting, but real quick here, this sequence was the final shot of that. This, of course, is lit the exact same way. This is what it was as shot. We then did a Rec 709 pass. We then chroma keyed that out, did our background, in this case foreground, did a color pass, and then of course that is how the final shot looks. So if you guys did watch True Detective season 1, this was a technique that they used a lot in that HBO sequence. It's also just a really, really cool effect where you can have things come through your foreground image, but is also a background image, and you're kind of playing with this really sweet double exposure stuff, which has a completely different process in photography than videography. But this is how you would go about approaching it that way. The fourth and final setup that we did for this was a different lighting setup, but for the same overall look. And that was for our subject that was wearing the wide-brimmed hat. We couldn't do the same lighting setup because the contrast shadows from the hat were a little too much. So for this, we took a 4x8 bounce, which you can see there. We flew it up overhead, and we took 2 of the 1x1 hards and blasted it into that, creating a very large, very soft light source. We used the Astra 6X in the background, which you can see here, again, as that edge light. We sent that up overhead. And then you can see here that we have a really nice, really soft light on our subject with this really cool background light coming up over the hand, which is then what you can kind of see here. But you can see the spill coming from camera left over the shoulder of our subject and over onto the hand of our subject, their right hand, but it's camera left. But then here, we actually don't have terrible shadows coming from the hat. And that was the piece that we really wanted to avoid. something we've talked about in previous episodes, which again, go on their website, you'll be able to see all of that stuff there, as well as their YouTube channel. But for this general lighting principle and behavior, the larger your light source's surface area in relationship to your talent, the softer that light is going to be. So this is a 1x1 surface area, which relatively speaking is of course a pretty small surface area, and it puts off pretty hard light. But if I take this light and I bounce it into a 4-foot by 8-foot surface area, that then changes the behavior of the light to make it a much softer light. So we took 2 of these, and I'll show you here. Let's get here. There we go. We took 2 of these 1x1 Gemini hards and we blasted them into this overhead bounce. So that is a ton of light that we're pushing into a bounce overhead, which of course, anytime we modify a light, we're going to be losing the intensity. Bounces the same way. So by taking 2 of them, I could still have a very large light source, but that light source is going to still be very, very bright because of those 2 fixtures. And then I threw an Astra up behind. We're using this as kind of like an edge slash kind of spill light coming up and over. But those 3 lights in combination with that overhead bounce is then how we get that really nice soft look on our talent, which with a wide brimmed hat, we definitely want to make sure we're not losing too much of the face in that hat shadow here. Paul says, do you also have any tips or tricks to get an evenly lit green screen? Absolutely. So couple of principles here. 1, you should pull your talent as far away from the surface of your green screen as possible while still maintaining the shot that you want to get. Of course, the closer they are to that green screen, the more spill there's going to be on them. So we want to make sure that we create that sense of separation. Once we have that separation, Paul, to your question, how we actually evenly light is directly dependent on how close or how far away that light is from our green screen. This again goes back to light behavior. It's not just about having bright light, it's about having a really even spread of that light, right? So by pulling our lights away from that green screen allows the spread of that light to extend further, which is going to give you a much more even key. The closer you bring those lights to your green screen, the more focused that beam angle is going to be and the more uneven that light is going to be. So if we pull our subject away from the green screen surface and then we take those light fixtures that we're going to be using to illuminate that green screen and we pull those back as far as we can, that is going to give a much more even key to our green screen. Most often, my students, the issues that they'll run into when compositing green screen is that their fixtures are simply too close to the surface that they're trying to illuminate, right? And this all goes back to light behavior. When we pull the lights further away, of course, going back to relative surface area, it's going to be a more harsh light, not brightness, just behavior. But because we're talking about a flat surface, that doesn't matter. What we're looking for is evenness. So pulling those fixtures away from our surface is going to give a much more even key. This is also why I'm going to preach this till the day that I die. You need to make sure whatever your budget is, you are buying the brightest, most accurate lights that budget can afford. In this case, the 1x1 hard, plenty bright, right? So if you need to light your background light, using super bright lights allows you to back those lights off to get the behavior that you want, that really even lighting that you want, right? Without losing so much of the intensity of that light or the brightness of that light that you then, of course, can't get a really nice exposure value off of that. So that's the simplest way. Pull the lights back, make sure that they're bright. That's going to help even that out, right? If you need to, then of course, if you don't have the look that you're going for, the next step that you would do is to diffuse that light, which again is going to increase that surface area and soften that light or extend that kind of spread or beam angle. But as we've discussed before, anytime we modify a light, we're losing intensity or we're losing spread. In this case, we'd be losing intensity. So you want to have a really bright light to do that. But if you do that, and that's how you're going to be doing it, which is totally fine, we then need to make sure, of course, that we're not getting spill from those lights onto our subject or onto our talent, or camera rather. So like in the fire example that we were talking about earlier, right, we used these flags in the front. We used these 6x6 duvetines in the front to prevent spill from coming onto the camera. You can do the same thing, and whether they're solids, flags, duvetine, however you want to block off that light. And you can set those between your light and your subject, the light that's illuminating your background. And that also is then going to help prevent spill from falling onto your subject, which then frees you up to light them however you see fit. The other issue to your question, Paul, when people are trying to then composite things that they have lit, is that if there is spill from their background fixtures onto the talent, it's then of course going to mess up how they then light their foreground, which is then going to make the believability of their compositing a lot tougher. Okay, so those are kind of the 4 quick breakdowns of those 4 sequences. I want to go through and we're going to watch the intro sequence again, so that way you guys can get a general sense for what you're looking at. I want you to pay attention to how believable our foreground work is with our background work. I want you to pay attention to how it looks together, right? Especially with the double exposure stuff, looking at that contrast, making sure that our key is clean. But it should just be invisible, right? We shouldn't pay attention to the fact that it's green screen. If you notice that it's green screen or you notice that it's composited, we've not done our job. It should all just seamlessly blend in one to another, and you shouldn't really pay attention to the fact that it is green screen, okay? So we're gonna watch this again here real quick, and then we can kind of keep going forward from there.
Dancing in between the lines, there's no space for me.
So 4 different styles of lighting, 4 different applications for how we go about doing that. All of that is green screen and composited, but it doesn't draw attention to itself. It doesn't allow itself to look or feel that way. Nobody should look at that and be like, wow, that chroma keying was bad, right? And that all entirely comes down to the lighting. Denise, to answer your question here, Denise says, I know that you used a studio. What lights were used for the chroma key in the background, and how far away were the lights from the grid to the background? So again, we're in a pre-lit studio. The ceiling, I believe, is either 35 or 40 feet high. It's a very large space, but those are lit with 2x1 Geminis across the background. Those are probably, I don't know, 6 to 8 feet above, and probably 8 to 10 feet away from the wall itself, right? So the green screen wall probably goes up about 25 feet. So probably about that 30 to 35 feet out and over is how they're lit. And it's lit with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7 of them. So the way that psych studio is set up is it's an L, it's a 90-degree angle. So there's a short wall and a long wall, and they're kind of lit along the side. There's also studio overheads too. What we would kind of call space lights, which kind of illuminate the floor, which is also green screen compositing. We didn't need to do any of that work, so we just lit the wall behind it. But again, bright lights, large surface area lights, and far enough away that it's kind of creating a really nice soft key all the way around. Okay, so that is a simple breakdown of how we go about and light each of those. I think we looked at all 4 of these. We did. Okay, so I know Eric's going to ask, because Eric has asked every time, which thank you for doing so. I'm going to, on my Instagram, put up this as well as some of the BTS and compositing stuff, because Zoom messes up the color So if you want to see a really accurate look at how the final product looks and how some of the compositing tips and tricks and that kind of stuff works, that's going to be going up on my Instagram later today. So if you want to see that, my Instagram handle is just at Garrett Sammons. Thank you, Light Panels team, for putting that up. So give me a follow on Instagram. That's the social media platform that I am most active on. That's where I post a lot of the cool stuff that I'm doing. And also, if you guys have questions after this about this or other things, feel free to DM me on there. And of course, I will do my best to answer your question or find the answer to that question. You're welcome, Eric. I got you, buddy. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up to Q&A. So whether this is questions about particular fixtures, about any of the lighting setups that we talked about green screen lighting in general, if you're working on a project that needs green screen compositing and you're looking for a little bit of help on that, this is the time for that. So that's a Q&A module and also in the chat as well. While people are working out that, couple things that I want to talk about with the Geminis, of course, we have the 1x1 hard. In some of the earlier episodes, we've talked about the Gemini 1x1 soft. Still an absolutely fantastic fixture. Going back to what your budget can afford, making sure that you have the brightest, most accurate lights possible. I have a spectrometer or a color meter to then measure the temperature of lights when we're filming things. I have used these lights now for about 4 years, give or take, the Gemini and Astra lights. And they are so color accurate that I no longer need to read those lights. I can trust the readout of those lights. So if I tap, 2700, 3200, 4000, 5000, 6000, or I just roll through, I know that these lights are going to produce the color that I want. So when we're working in a mixed environment, I'm using other types of fixtures, I'll actually get a color read on those fixtures and then just dial in what I need to hear to match those lights, because I could trust these way more than I can trust other brands. So if 1x1 hard is out of the budget, a 1x1 soft is an unbelievably fantastic fixture. And if we continue to go down, the next one, of course, is the Astra, which we used a lot on this scene. This light, as you can tell, is also a 1x1. It is an incredibly bright light. This is, at least here in America, one of the industry standard for broadcast. So all of your sporting event interviews, your news interviews, those kind of things, they lean on these all of the time. So if a Gemini is a little bit out of reach, these lights are fantastic. And the nice thing with the 6X is it is a bicolor light. So you can then dial in how warm to cool you want this fixture to be, as well as the intensity of this fixture. One of the cool things Light Panels is doing right now with this is that they are doing a giveaway. I believe there's 3 of them that they are giving away. They'll throw a link to the giveaway there. Yep, there we go. Boom. And it comes with the light as well as accessories for it. So I think it's like a carrying case, a soft box, the one that we looked at today, and some other accessories. It's like $2,000 per light kit. They're giving away 3 of them. There's a link there to sign up to then, of course, possibly win one of these. But this is a great way to start building your light kit, because the only thing that makes something look cinematic versus amateur comes down to the lighting. It's not the camera. It's not the lensing. Those things are so minuscule in comparison to the quality of lighting. If it's lit well, it's going to look good. If it's lit poorly, it doesn't matter if you're working with the best camera in the world. It's not going to work. If an Astra is still a little out of your price range while you're starting out, their beginning entry-level light is called the Lycos Plus, which is this little guy here. This front should look familiar. This is the exact same diode setup that is on the 6X Astra, but of course it's just kind of a quarter of that light. It too is a bicolor light and intensity light. It runs off of Sony L batteries or NPF batteries. So the Lycos Plus is an awesome light, super small, super lightweight. You can kind of mount it anywhere. I use these when I travel if I can't carry a bunch of gear. But always, 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 no matter what, buy the brightest, most accurate light your budget can afford. All right, let's get into questions here. Okay. So Daniel says, if you weren't in the studio, how would you like the background? Let's say a small studio with a paper backdrop. Daniel, great question. First of all, highly recommend a paper backdrop over a muslin backdrop. Savage is a great company that makes great paper backdrops. The nice thing with a paper backdrop is it's not going to wrinkle in the same way that muslin does. So paper backdrops all the way, if you can store them. Muslin obviously packs down smaller, but paper is going to give you that. We talked about it a little earlier, Daniel, but we'll kind of go back to this here. I'll use this example here. If I were to light this and I wasn't in a studio environment, where I have my 1x1 Gemini hards now, right? I have them focused in this case on my talent. This was the fire sequence that we did. I would also have two lights at opposing 45-degree angles, simply pointed at my backdrop, right? So I can't remember who asked the question earlier, but Paul did. But what I would like to do is make sure that you pull your lights as far away from your background as you can while still getting that brightness or that intensity that you need. And having two lights at 45-degree angles opposing the backdrop and filming at the backdrop, or lighting at the backdrop rather, that is going to eliminate shadows. That is going to eliminate uneven spots. But by pulling those lights away, it's going to give you a larger spread of light, which is going to make a much more even key. So pull your subject away from the background as far as you can while still being able to get the shot that you want. Make sure that you pull the lights as far away from your backdrop as you can while still being able to maintain the exposure that you need. And those two pieces are going to really, really help making sure your backdrop is as evenly lit as possible. And then, of course, flag off your lights from your talent to make sure you're not getting background spill onto your talent, so that way you can light it how you want. But the biggest thing that people mess up is, of course, their fixtures are too close to their backdrop when they're lighting it, and then you're getting hot spots and low spots in that. It's going to make chroma keying it a lot more difficult. So pull those lights away. That's going to increase the beam angle. That's going to make it much more even. That's why you need bright lights, right? Cannot stress this enough. The biggest issue that people run into when they buy entry-level lights, whatever that means for the individual, is the fixture itself isn't bright enough to be able to modify it in the way to get it to behave how they want. And then now you have to bring lights in because you have to, not because you want to. And that's going to really mess up the way that you want your fixtures to look. Denise says, are you using the modules for the readout for the Astra to match your Kelvin? Yeah, so the difference between the Astras and the Geminis is the Geminis have this LED screen here on the back, which gives me a lot of exact custom readouts. With the Astras, it's dials. So you don't have the specificity in the same way that you do with the Geminis. That said, what I'll do is I will use a spectrometer or a color meter, and I'll get an exact read off of an Astra, and I can adjust that and dial that in exactly how I want. But it goes from 2,700 to 6,000, I believe, in terms of the range of the Astra 6X. So I have a general sense of where I'm dialing it in, but I will take a read on it just to make sure that I'm nailing the exact Kelvin readout that I want with those. Okay. Let's see here. Got more questions coming in here. So Ryan says, I have a traditional green screen setup with a single speaker educational videos, 8 lights, and a Panasonic 200 DVX. 2 of the lights will be set to light the speaker at 45s in the front. I have other 3 1x1 softs overhead lighting the green screen. Should the other 3 softs light the speaker from overhead, behind, or in front? Okay, so Ryan, this would fall more into what we would call kind of a traditional 3-point setup. If we are going to be lighting for an individual who's speaking, right? I think that you're absolutely right to use your 2 Gemini 1x1 softs to illuminate your backgrounds. 45s, pull them off, make sure that they're really far away, illuminate those, bright that thing, will be great there. When it comes to lighting your speaker, on the other hand, that would then, we would kind of fall more into kind of a traditional 3-point. I know in previous episodes of this series, we've talked about how to light interviews. That one goes into 3-point lighting. But what I would do for something like that is, again, you want contrast from one side to the other, our key side to our fill side. So having a bright Gemini 1x1 soft from the key side is great. Dimming a secondary one down, again, is going to then fill in any unwanted shadows, but still making sure that we're kind of 1 to 2 stops different from one cheek to the other. And then I would use probably a third one from up and behind, again, to give you a really nice edge light or crown light to separate your foreground from your background. Generally, when it comes to hair lights, edge lights, back lights, cut lights, crown lights, they all do slightly different things. And depending on the DP you're working with, they'll call it something else. But generally, the purpose is to separate. You don't want it to be so bright that it's noticeable. Generally, you want that light to be just bright enough that it works, right? You can turn it off, turn it on. You can see a little bit of a difference, but nobody should really notice that it's there. The only time you want somebody to notice that a backlight is there is if we're motivating an existing source within whatever our background environment is, or if we are kind of creating a stylistic look with it. But by and large, simple 3-point lighting for what you're talking about, educational kind of content, would be totally fine. But it's really making sure that your exposure is the same between them, that we're lighting our green screen, we're setting our exposure for that green screen, and then we're setting up our foreground lights to match that level of exposure. Another person asked, what assistance tools do you use mostly for green screen? Is it false color, vector scope, or something else? So generally speaking, for solo owner operators and for kind of smaller indie style shoots, false color is going to be your best friend, hands down, all day, every day. I cannot preach small HD monitors enough. They are an industry standard monitor for a reason, and they just have a brand new OS that's come out, Page OS 5, which adds even more functionality and features to it. False color, hands down, your best friend. If you're on larger sets and you're working with DIT will of course be using vector scopes, parades, and waveforms, but they have a more intrinsic understanding of what they're looking at than you necessarily would. More so than a vector scope, I think that waveforms, if you really kind of want to get a more specific look, waveforms are really going to help, and specifically a full parade waveform, because that's going to separate your red channel, your green channel, and your blue channel. And that's going to really help indicate how well your green is going to be exposed. So false color would be the first thing I'd recommend. If you want to get a little bit more specific, I would say full parade waveform more than vector scope. If you know how to read scopes, fantastic. You can use scopes, but scopes take a little bit more, especially if you're using like log or raw, to understand how to use them to get them to do what you want. So false color first, and then full parade waveforms would be second. Josh, what about using false color to evenly light a background? So false color is 100% going to be the easiest way to notice your exposure or how even your lighting is on the background. We've talked about false color before. Also, there's an entire episode about false color on my YouTube channel. That's just youtube.com/Garrett Sammons. There's an entire episode about false color there. But yes, the readout of false color is going to show you if you have hot spots or dark spots within the lighting of your background. What I do when I'm setting up my initial camera is I will illuminate my green screen, light it how I feel is even. Before I put any lights, before I put my subject, before I put any foreground elements at all, I then will look at my false color to see if there's hot spots, to see if there's more dark spots, adjust for those, and then bring in my foreground elements. Dahl says, how about lighting a full body shot with a green floor? Totally fine. Absolutely doable, something that happens all of the time. The things that you need to pay attention to when you're lighting full body shots is the amount of spill. You can pull your subject far away from the background as possible, and that's going to eliminate a lot of that spill. But if they are standing in a full body environment, obviously they're standing on the ground. They can't get any further away from the ground. So there is going to intrinsically be green spill coming up onto your subject from the floor. When you have that, you can adjust for that a little bit in the way that you chroma key, but generally speaking, you're going to have to start doing things like rotoscoping or live masking and that kind of stuff, because that spill is going to be really hard to counteract without kind of losing some of the detail in the feet. Last month, we did a session on lighting for natural lighting environments. That we then, of course, composited the boy who was in the final shot, the small kid, wasn't available on the day of shooting. So we then composited them into the shot. But his feet were in grass, so we couldn't use green screen because I needed the grass. So we actually did a blue screen. Principles are the exact same. We're just pulling the color off of a different channel. Okay, so man, we've got way more here going on. Okay, so the next episode that we're doing real quick here before we go any further, we're going to be talking about how to shoot commercial work. So this is going to be product commercial work. This is going to be fashion commercial work. This is going to be kind of general portraiture commercial work. This is a way that a lot of filmmakers break into the industry, is by doing kind of corporate work or commercial work. So we're going to be looking at 3 different examples next week, which is the first time that we're breaking into something quite that big. So if you want to get into commercial work, if you want to do fashion work, you want to do beauty work, you want to do let's see here, you want to do product work, any of that kind of commercial work, we're going to be diving in and breaking down how to do that. So make sure that you go to the link that's right there. They have just put that in to register for that. That's what we're going to be doing next month. All right, here we go. Wow. Let's get into this here. Greetings from Italy. Really glad that you guys are here. Opinion on the app Green Screener by Hollywood Camera Work to balance your greens or your backgrounds and your green screens. I don't know enough about the app for that, but my guess, Tony, on that would be the cameras on your smart devices, whether it's your phones or your iPads, have a very, very limited dynamic range. Far more limited than your cameras. Even if you're shooting on mirrorless or DSLR cameras, it's not going to be quite the same. So as such, I'm not entirely sure how accurate that's going to be. The most accurate thing you're going to get is false color off of a dedicated monitor that's attached to the camera that's actually doing the capturing. Without a doubt, that itself is going to be the best thing. I know that Small HD just launched a new entry-level monitor. I think it's called the Action 5, which I would think is going to be the best kind of monitor to start with. And then, of course, work your way up as you kind of grow. But I don't know enough about the app to give you anything on there for that. What's the minimum distance from talent to green screen to avoid green spills? Shankar, that depends entirely on the size of the green screen that you're working on. So like the studio that we're in, that's a 65-foot green screen. So you're going to need to pull way further away from that to avoid spill than you would if you're just using like a 6-foot pop-up or paper backdrop. Generally, pull as far away from your background as possible while still being able to get the shot that you want. So that's not necessarily any given distance or focal length. It's just lens it and separate it as much as you can while still being able to get the look that you're going for there. Okay, so we're wrapping this up quickly because we've got this. Let's see here. Eric says, if you don't have anything else, these apps to spot uneven lit areas on the green screen, it saved his bacon once. Okay, great. So if the app worked for you in a pinch, that's fantastic. Still lean on monitors. Monitors are your best friend. You should never be out in the field filming with a camera without a monitor. Last question. Are there any specific reasons to use green or blue screens? Yeah, it depends on what your foreground elements are. Generally, when we're filming digital, green screen is always going to be the best thing. Sensors in digital cameras are always going to be Bayer arrays generally, which means it's going to have twice as many green pixels as it has red or blue pixels, which is why we use green screen for digital cameras. We would use blue screen if there are elements that we have to have in our shot that are green. So we can't, of course, pull a green key because that's going to then ruin what we're filming, because it's going to then make somebody, like if we were to use a green screen on me, I've got all these leaves in my shirt, I'm then just going to look like I've been shot full of holes. That's not going to work very well. So green is always the default. Blue is what we would use if there are elements that are green that we need to preserve. Okay. Wow. You guys have had a lot of questions. This has been a ton of fun. If you have more questions, feel free to ask them. Just DM me on Instagram. I will do my best to get to all of you and answer any further questions that you have. In addition, I will be posting more about this on my Instagram later today. So make sure that you follow me there for that. Do register for next month where we talk about commercial work. Make sure that you sign up for that Astra 6X giveaway. That is an incredible opportunity to kick off your lighting game with super bright, super accurate lights. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thanks so much.